a prestigious bank in downtown Los Angeles, where wealth flows freely and elite clients are treated like royalty. Michael Grant, a well-dressed black man, walks in for a routine withdrawal. But the moment he reaches the counter, the atmosphere shifts. The teller barely looks at his ID before sliding it back, her voice laced with thinly veiled condescension. "We can't process this." Minutes later, security is dragging him out while white customers walk away with stacks of cash. No questions asked. What they don't know is that they just humiliated the wrong man. When his true identity is revealed, he won't just reclaim his money. He'll teach them a lesson they'll never forget. The Brixton Financial Bank was a monument to wealth. Nestled in the heart of downtown Los Angeles, it stood like a shimmering fortress of prestige. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the interior in golden sunlight, reflecting off the gleaming marble floors. The air carried the faint, rich aroma of freshly brewed espresso from the VIP lounge, where well-dressed executives sipped lattes while murmuring about stock portfolios and private equity deals. There was a rhythm to this place, a quiet hum of exclusivity, where transactions worth more than some people's annual salaries happened with a mere nod. Michael Grant stepped through the entrance, his polished leather shoes clicking softly against the tile. At 42 years old, he carried himself with the kind of measured confidence that came from years of success. He wasn't flashy. He never needed to be. His tailored navy blazer and charcoal slacks were sharp but understated. No gaudy watches, no loud accessories, just presence. A presence that, in the right rooms, turned heads. And yet, he had long learned that in places like this, his presence alone would never be enough. Still, this was a simple visit. A routine transaction. Nothing unusual. Or so he thought. As he approached the teller counter, his sharp gaze swept across the room. A middle-aged white man stood at the counter just ahead of him. Richard Lawson, a well-known real estate investor. He was dressed in a charcoal gray blazer, speaking casually with the teller. A warm, almost flirtatious exchange. Michael's eyes drifted toward the sleek transaction slip in Richard's hand. Just long enough to see the numbers printed at the top, $30,000. Michael watched as the teller, a blonde woman in her mid-30s, wearing a crisp navy blue blazer with a neatly pinned name tag that read, Jessica Moore, smiled warmly as she counted out the cash in neat stacks. No hesitation, no questions. The entire transaction took less than a minute. Richard took the money, nodded appreciatively, and strolled toward the exit, his wallet noticeably thicker, his gait relaxed, smooth, effortless. Michael exhaled softly, feeling the familiar weight settle in his chest, the weight of experience, of expectation. But he didn't let it show. With the same quiet confidence that had made him one of the most sought-after financial consultants in the country, he stepped forward. Jessica's eyes shifted from the departing customer to Michael, and in that split second, something changed. The warm professionalism, the easy, welcoming smile she had just given Richard, vanished. Her expression turned neutral, controlled, not rude, just different. It was the kind of subtle shift Michael had seen 1,000 times before. A flicker of judgment, a split-second calculation of who was standing in front of her, and whether they belonged. Jessica barely glanced at him before sliding a clipboard forward across the counter. Fill this out. No greeting, no eye contact. Just like that, the tone had shifted. Michael's fingers brushed over the pen clipped to the form, but he didn't pick it up right away. Instead, he looked at Jessica, his gaze steady. This was a test, and he already knew how it would go. With a calm, measured breath, he took the pen, filled out the required fields, and handed the slip back along with his ID. Jessica picked up the paper but barely glanced at his identification. She looked at the amount instead. $20,000. Her lips pressed into a thin line. And then, without a single moment of consideration, she pushed the slip back toward him. "We can't process this transaction." The words fell flat, delivered with the kind of detached authority that left no room for negotiation. Michael's expression didn't change. He had expected it. He just hadn't expected it to happen so fast. He glanced back toward the VIP lounge, where executives sipped their coffee in peace, where transactions flowed without question. Then he looked toward the exit, where Richard Lawson had just walked out with more cash than he was asking for. Michael's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before he relaxed it again. And then, calmly, smoothly, he looked back at Jessica and asked the question that would change everything. Why? Jessica Moore barely glanced at the withdrawal slip before shoving it back across the counter. We can't process this transaction. The words were delivered flatly, without hesitation, without even a second look at his information. A decision already made before she ever read the details. Michael Grant didn't move. He had expected something subtle, maybe a few extra security questions, a double check of his ID, or a standard, "Give me one moment while I verify your request." But this was too quick, too absolute. His eyes lifted slowly to meet Jessica's. She wasn't looking at him. Her posture was professional, stiff, composed, but her hands were already moving to set the slip aside, as if the matter had already been decided. Michael's fingers rested lightly on the countertop. He didn't react. He calculated. A long, silent beat passed between them. Then finally he raised an eyebrow. "I just watched you approve the same request for the man before me." Jessica's shoulders tensed just slightly, but her eyes remained focused on the desk, as if pretending she hadn't heard him. She reached for the small stack of documents beside her, flipping through them in an exaggerated display of busyness. "It's bank policy," she said. Not a real answer, just a pre-programmed response. Michael's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before he loosened it again. A lesser man might have snapped, demanded to see the policy, caused a scene. But Michael was not that man. He had seen this kind of thing too many times before. He had learned long ago that in spaces like this, in the polished corridors of wealth and power, where everything was supposed to be professional and by the book, discrimination was never loud, never obvious. It was hidden beneath rules and policies that bent when they needed to. Michael inhaled slowly. "Which policy, exactly?" he asked, his voice level. Jessica's lips pressed into a thin line. A hesitation. The first real sign that she was aware this wasn't a simple refusal. This was something else. Michael glanced toward the glass-walled manager's office, where Rachel Denton, the branch manager, stood near her desk, watching the interaction with mild interest. She didn't step in, didn't intervene, but she saw everything. Jessica shifted uncomfortably. Rachel's presence was both a safety net and silent permission. Jessica wasn't acting alone. This was approved behavior. Michael exhaled through his nose, steadying himself. His instincts told him to push, but not yet. Instead, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "If there's an issue with my account, I'd like to know exactly what it is." Jessica finally looked up at him. For the first time, she made eye contact. And what Michael saw in her expression wasn't confusion. It wasn't even discomfort. It was irritation. Irritation that he wasn't accepting the answer she had already decided on. She inhaled sharply, as if summoning patience, then straightened her back. "Large withdrawals require additional security checks," she said, her tone clipped, rehearsed. Michael tilted his head. "I understand, but you didn't check anything." Another long pause. Jessica's fingers tapped lightly against the desk. A small, quick movement. A tell. Michael had worked in finance long enough to recognize it. She was stalling. Not because she needed to look anything up, but because she was deciding how far to push back before this became a problem. She glanced toward Rachel again. Michael followed her gaze. Rachel hadn't moved, but she had given something small, a barely perceptible nod. And just like that, Jessica turned back with renewed confidence. "I need to involve security," she said. There it was. The first undeniable sign of bias had just played out. Michael inhaled once, deeply, then exhaled. His fingers tapped the counter once before settling. His mind was already 10 steps ahead. He knew exactly how this was going to go, and he knew exactly how it was going to end. Jessica just didn't know it yet. Jessica Moore's fingers drummed lightly against the counter. The polite mask she had worn when serving the previous customer. Gone. She exhaled sharply, her irritation flickering through as she adjusted the stack of forms beside her. A reflex more than anything. Avoidance. A deliberate pause. Michael Grant didn't let the silence sit for long. "I'd like you to check my account," he said, his voice measured, controlled. "My funds are more than sufficient." Jessica finally looked up, and for a split second something passed over her face. A flicker of hesitation, a brief second where she considered just processing the transaction and moving on. But then, she straightened, exhaling through her nose. "It's just an unusual request," she said quickly. "Large withdrawals are flagged." Michael's expression didn't change. He had dealt with CEOs, hedge fund managers, and billionaires. He knew exactly when someone was covering insecurity with confidence. And Jessica was doing it now. "Did you flag the last transaction?" he asked, his voice smooth, but his words deliberate. Precise. A scalpel, not a hammer. Jessica stiffened. That was the moment. The subtle tightening of her posture, the shift in her breathing, the quick glance toward Rachel. She had been called out, and she knew it. Michael could have pressed harder right then and there, forced her to acknowledge the obvious disparity between how she had treated Richard Lawson versus him. But instead, he waited, because he knew Jessica was about to dig her own grave. "I don't make the rules, sir," she said. Her tone clipped. Michael tilted his head slightly, studying her. Then, with perfect calm, he said the words that cut deeper than any raised voice ever could. "No, but you sure know how to enforce them selectively." Jessica's mouth tightened, her frustration boiling just beneath the surface. Michael knew that to people like her, silence was the real threat. They were used to controlling conversations, setting the tone, shutting things down before they escalated. But right now, she wasn't in control, and she knew it. Her eyes flicked toward Rachel Denton again. Michael followed her gaze, casually, unhurried. Rachel had been watching everything. She hadn't intervened. She hadn't stopped Jessica. She had let this play out. And now, as Jessica searched for approval, Rachel gave her the same silent confirmation as before. A single, small nod. That was all Jessica needed. She squared her shoulders. Her hesitation was gone. Now, she had permission. Her next words came too quickly, too practiced, too final, delivered not as a request, but as a decision. "I need to involve security." Michael let out a slow breath, not a sigh of frustration, not a reaction of defeat, just a quiet acknowledgement of exactly what was happening. He had given them every opportunity to do the right thing. Now, he was going to watch them tear themselves apart. The air inside Brixton Financial Bank had changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in energy, a quiet tension that settled over the room like an approaching storm. No one spoke, but everyone felt it. Jessica Moore stood rigidly behind the counter, her hands clenched as if bracing for what came next. Rachel Denton, the branch manager, remained in her office, watching through the glass walls like an uninterested spectator in a rigged game. And then, Henry Carter arrived, the head of security, a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s, built like a human battering ram. His navy blue uniform stretched across his stocky frame, his belt weighed down with a radio, handcuffs, and the quiet promise of authority. He moved with the swagger of someone who was used to being obeyed. Michael Grant didn't turn to face him immediately. Instead, he let the heavy footsteps approach, his gaze still locked on Jessica, letting the moment breathe, letting it settle. Then, finally, he turned. Henry stopped 2 feet away, feet squared, arms tense at his sides. "Sir, I need you to step outside." Michael met his eyes, his face unreadable. "Why?" he asked, his voice unshaken, unbothered. "Because I asked for my own money?" Henry's expression didn't change. He didn't explain, didn't justify, didn't even pretend this was anything other than what it was. Instead, he reached forward, fast, forceful, his thick fingers wrapped around Michael's forearm. Michael didn't resist, didn't flinch, didn't move at all. A slow beat passed, and then, the scene unfolded. The room, once filled with the quiet hum of transactions and polite conversation, had gone silent. Eyes lifted from paperwork, from phone screens, from half-sipped espresso cups. Every customer, every teller, every bystander in that building knew exactly what was happening. But no one spoke. No one stepped forward. A woman near the customer service desk, Linda Shaw, a well-dressed white woman in her late 50s, shifted uncomfortably. She clutched her designer purse tighter against her side, her lips parting slightly. She wanted to say something, wanted to object. But then, her gaze flicked to Rachel Denton, still standing calmly behind the glass office. And just like that, Linda closed her mouth. Michael saw it all. Every tiny movement, every hesitated breath, every conscious decision to look away. Henry tightened his grip. "Let's go," he said. And just like that, Michael was being forced toward the glass doors. His heels scraped against the floor as Henry shoved him forward, past the velvet ropes separating the VIP section from the standard queue, past the other customers who suddenly found the floor, the ceiling, and their own hands very interesting. The glass doors swung open as Michael was pushed outside. And then, the final insult. His ID, the small plastic card, his proof of identity, his credentials, his validation, was tossed carelessly to the pavement. It landed with a sharp, lifeless clatter, the ultimate dismissal. The bank had thrown him away. And then, another shift. A second security guard stood just inside the entrance, watching. Marcus Reed. A black man in his mid-30s, built leaner than Henry but with the same uniform, the same corporate-issued badge, the same chain of command. He had seen this play out before, too many times. His jaw tightened. For a moment he looked at Henry, then at Jessica inside the bank, then finally at Michael, standing still, back straight, his ID abandoned at his feet. And then, without hesitation, Marcus stepped forward. He bent down, picked up the ID, dusted it off, carefully, a gesture that held more weight than anyone around them understood, and handed it back. "They always do this," he muttered under his breath. Michael took the card. For the first time, his fingers curled around it tightly. But still, no reaction, no anger, no words. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and made a call. Michael stood just outside the glass doors of Brixton Financial Bank, the morning sun casting a harsh glare against the sleek exterior. Behind him, the city moved as if nothing had happened. Cars rolled past, pedestrians hurried along the sidewalks, oblivious to the quiet humiliation that had just unfolded. Inside the bank, however, the energy was different. Rachel Denton, the branch manager, had already returned to her desk, her posture relaxed, her expression composed. Jessica Moore remained at her station, flipping through paperwork as if she hadn't just refused a legitimate transaction and called security on a man she never even bothered to verify. Henry Carter, the head of security, stood near the entrance, arms crossed, his stance wide, a silent enforcer, a guardian of a system that had just done exactly what it was designed to do. And yet, Michael wasn't angry. Anger was a reaction, and Michael didn't react. He calculated. He executed. He pulled his phone from his pocket, thumb hovering over a single contact. Then, he pressed dial. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. "Oliver Pierce." Michael didn't waste time. "Oliver, I need you at the Brixton branch. Now." A pause. Not the pause of hesitation. Not the pause of uncertainty. The pause of a man who already knew this wasn't a request. Then came the answer. "Give me 15 minutes. The call ended. Michael slid the phone back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. And then, he waited. Not pacing, not shifting, not looking around like a man seeking validation from onlookers. Just standing there, still, composed, unmoving. Henry Carter watched him through the glass doors, his brow furrowing slightly. Something about Michael's posture made him uneasy, like a storm gathering just beyond the horizon. Rachel, too, stole a brief glance toward the entrance, as if sensing a disturbance in the very structure she thought she controlled. But neither of them moved. Neither of them knew. 15 minutes. That was all it would take to change everything. The low hum of an expensive engine cut through the morning air. From his place outside the glass doors of Brixton Financial Bank, Michael Grant didn't move. He didn't need to turn around to know who had just arrived. Inside, however, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Rachel Denton, seated at her desk, froze mid-keystroke. Her posture stiffened as she looked up, the realization creeping in before she even saw him. Jessica Moore, still behind the counter, clutched her clipboard a little tighter, her knuckles white against the paper. Even Henry Carter, the head of security, who had so confidently escorted Michael out minutes earlier, adjusted his stance, suddenly more alert than before. Then, the car door opened, and Oliver Pierce stepped out. The name carried weight, not just within Brixton Financial, but across the financial world. A billionaire, a power player, a man who didn't tolerate incompetence, and sure as hell didn't tolerate injustice. His presence alone sent a ripple of unease through the bank. Tall, sharply dressed in a tailored black suit, he moved with the unshaken confidence of a man who owned everything he walked into. Because in most cases, he did. He didn't scan the building, didn't acknowledge the security guard standing at the door, didn't even glance at Rachel, Jessica, or Henry. He walked straight to Michael. "What the hell happened?" Oliver asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man who already knew the answer, but wanted to hear it anyway. Only then did Michael move. He turned, slowly, deliberately. "I came in for a withdrawal," he said, his tone even. "They denied it, called security, had me thrown out." Oliver's jaw tightened. His cold blue eyes flicked toward the glass doors, landing on Rachel Denton, who was already rising from her desk. She smoothed down the front of her blazer and forced a tight, professional smile as she stepped forward. "Mr. Pierce," she began, voice steady but strained at the edges. "I assure you, this is just a misunderstanding." Oliver held up a hand. She stopped speaking immediately. The moment stretched, long enough for Rachel to understand that she had just lost control of the conversation. Then Oliver turned fully toward her. "No, Rachel," he said, his voice quiet but slicing through the air like a blade. "The only misunderstanding is that you thought this man was beneath you." The room went completely silent. And then, the final blow. "Michael Grant isn't just a customer." Oliver let the words hang for a moment, watching the growing horror in Rachel's eyes. "He's a partner in this bank." The statement landed like a bomb. Jessica visibly paled. Henry Carter took a step back, his shoulders tensing. And Rachel, who had started the morning so confidently in control of her domain, now looked like a woman who knew she had just destroyed her own career. Michael exhaled slowly. It was satisfying, watching them realize, too late, who they had just thrown out. And the best part? They weren't done paying for it yet. Rachel Denton stood frozen, her carefully composed expression crumbling by the second. Jessica Moore's breath hitched, her clipboard suddenly feeling too heavy in her hands. Henry Carter shifted uncomfortably, arms still crossed, but the earlier authority in his stance had vanished. Oliver Pierce didn't yell. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His words carried the kind of finality that left no room for argument, no room for negotiation. "Rachel," he said, staring straight at her. "You're fired. Effective immediately." Rachel's lips parted, shock, disbelief, and panic all colliding at once. "Sir, please, if I could just explain." "There's nothing to explain." Oliver cut her off, his tone colder than steel. "You saw this happening. You let it happen. Hell, you encouraged it." Rachel opened her mouth again, but no words came out. She wasn't used to being on the other side of power. But today, she was powerless. Oliver turned next to Jessica, who had gone pale as a sheet. "Jessica, consider this your last day." Jessica gasped quietly. "Mr. Pierce, Pack your things," Oliver continued, completely uninterested in her excuses. "I don't run banks that profile their own clients. If you can't handle that, you don't belong here." Jessica looked down at her clipboard, gripping it so tightly her knuckles turned white. She had spent years working her way up in this industry, and in less than 5 minutes, she had lost everything, because she had made a choice, and that choice had consequences. Then Oliver turned to Henry Carter, the head of security. Henry, to his credit, didn't speak. He didn't try to defend himself. He already knew he had miscalculated. "Your entire security team will be reviewed for misconduct," Oliver stated, his voice sharp. "If I find out this isn't the first time something like this has happened, I'll make sure you never work security again." A flicker of nervousness passed through Henry's eyes, but he gave a stiff nod. He knew better than to argue. Then, for the first time since stepping foot inside, Oliver's gaze shifted toward Marcus Reed. The black security guard, who had picked up Michael's ID, now stood still, watching everything unfold with quiet disbelief. "What's your name?" Oliver asked. Marcus blinked once before answering. "Marcus Reed, sir." Oliver nodded, thoughtful. "Not anymore." Marcus frowned slightly. "Sir, as of today, you're the new head of security," Oliver said simply. A stunned silence rippled through the bank. Even Marcus looked momentarily taken aback. "Me?" he asked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "You stepped up when no one else did," Oliver replied. "That tells me everything I need to know." Marcus hesitated, then slowly nodded, straightening his posture. He had worked at Brixton Financial for years, overlooked, underappreciated. But today things changed. Oliver didn't wait for a response. He had already decided. Then, finally, his attention returned to Michael Grant. "Shall we?" Oliver gestured toward the glass doors. Michael didn't hesitate. He stepped forward. Not as the man who had been thrown out minutes earlier. Not as the man who had been humiliated in front of silent onlookers. But as the man who belonged here. As he entered, the same customers who had turned away earlier now watched in stunned silence. Michael didn't acknowledge them. He didn't need to. Jessica had been removed from the teller station. A new teller, visibly nervous, took her place behind the counter. Without hesitation, she processed Michael's withdrawal. $20,000, his money, his. The crisp stacks of bills were counted out carefully and placed in front of him. Not a word was spoken. The weight of the moment didn't need words. Michael picked up the cash, tucking it neatly into his wallet. Then, he turned one last time to Rachel Denton, who still stood by her desk, her face pale, her hands shaking slightly. And he said the words that would haunt her long after he walked out of that building. "Next time, check who you're throwing out." Then, without another glance, he turned and walked away. And this time, no one dared stop him. A hush settled over Brixton Financial Bank, heavier than the polished marble floors and towering glass walls. No one spoke. No one moved. Rachel Denton stood frozen near her desk, the weight of what had just happened settling into her bones like ice. Jessica Moore had already gathered her things, her clipboard clutched to her chest like it could somehow shield her from the consequences. Henry Carter remained near the entrance, his hands clenched into fists, not out of defiance, but out of the sinking realization that his authority, his control, had been reduced to nothing in a matter of minutes. And then there was Michael Grant, the man they had dismissed, the man they had humiliated. Now, the man who had won. He turned slowly, locking eyes with Rachel one last time. And then, with perfect calm, he delivered the final words that would echo in her mind long after he left that building. Next time, check who you're throwing out. The words landed like a hammer on glass, splintering the thin layer of control Rachel had tried so desperately to maintain. She opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. Michael didn't wait for a response. He simply turned and walked away. His pace was measured, unhurried, not the exit of a man retreating, but of a man reclaiming his space. As he moved, eyes followed him. The same tellers who had looked away when security dragged him out now watched in silence. The customers who had pretended not to see, not to hear, not to care, suddenly found their gazes glued to him, as if witnessing something they would never forget. Even Marcus Reed, the newly promoted head of security, stood near the door, arms crossed, a knowing look in his eyes. And then, just before Michael stepped through the glass doors, just before the fresh air of downtown Los Angeles greeted him once more, something happened. A slow clap, not loud, not exaggerated, but deliberate. Michael didn't turn to look, but he felt it. A few more hands joined in, uncertain at first, then growing in confidence. Not everyone, not Rachel, not Jessica, not Henry, but enough. Michael stepped outside. The crisp morning air met him, cool and refreshing, washing away the stale tension of the bank. The sleek black car that had brought Oliver Pierce was still idling at the curb. But Michael? He wasn't getting in. Not yet. Not before taking one last moment to himself. He reached into his pocket, running his fingers over the smooth plastic of his ID card, the very thing they had tried to strip him of. The irony wasn't lost on him. The only difference between power and powerlessness was perception. And today, perception had changed forever. He let out a slow breath, then slid his ID back into his wallet, and with a final glance at the gleaming Brixton Financial sign above the entrance, Michael Grant did what he had always done best. He walked forward, because that was the thing about power. Once you reclaimed it, you never let it go again. And this time, no one dared stop him.